Aloha, I'm Jennifer Sunrise Winter from the University of Hawaii, and I'll be addressing Is Internet Access a Human Right? I'll begin with some context regarding the right to communicate debates, and also briefly mention the Universal Service Principle. And then I'll spend most of my time addressing the United Nations Declaration in 2011 that many have interpreted to mean that Internet access is a human right. And then I'll conclude with some thoughts about where we can go from here in this debate. So the robust debate about whether or not Internet access is a human right has deep intellectual roots that extend into what is now described as the right to communicate debates. And these have their own intellectual roots stretching as far back as the 17th century in the works of John Milton, as DeCurry and Birdsall have pointed out. The present understanding of the right to communicate really is in the context of Article 19 of the UDHR, which is from 1948, which addresses the right to information. And this concept has evolved with prevailing ICTs. So for example, the right to communicate itself as a term arose in 1969 when John Darcy first used the term in the context of satellite communications. He noted a shift from one-way models of communication to the potential for more participatory models, and he ignited existing concern about information inequalities around the world that were already brewing. And there were many passionate debates throughout the 1970s and early 1980s centering on fair world communication policies. This is also a time when globalization was first being observed and discussed. There was an awareness of the opportunities and threats related to the global exchange of economic and political information. Of course, during this time, we also had the New World Information and Communication Order discussions, which channeled long-held concerns about media representation in less developed nations, and also the imbalanced flow of information between regions. And so there was a real struggle for consensus throughout the 1970s and until the mid-80s about what the right to communicate would entail. It was understood to be a very complex, multidimensional concept that was also a foundation for other rights. In 1983, at the UNESCO General Conference in Paris, it was anticipated by many that there would be a formal resolution on the right to communicate. However, there was a great deal of political sensitivity surrounding the discussion, and this halted any progress on the definition of the RTC or its formal recognition. So, concern about the RTC didn't disappear, but because of these political sensitivities, was sort of under the radar for several decades. However, as the internet use diffused throughout the world, there's been a resurgence of interest, and the right to communicate as a term has been used more and more. A major argument here is that in an information society where access, creation, manipulation, and distribution of information are key aspects of our political, economic, sociocultural lives, a lack of access to ICTs and relevant content puts individuals, regions, or nations at a great disadvantage. You'll note here too the focus is on the digital divide or access to networks or skills. In 2003, the World Summit on the Information Society was seen as a place where the right to communicate might make its resurgence. And prior to the summit, there was a call to formally recognize the RTC as a provision of international law. This effort was spearheaded by the Communication Rights in the Information Society, or CRIS campaign, and it was hoped that the RTC would become embodied in international law in the context of the WSIS's meeting. As Hamelink has pointed out, this Universal Declaration was expected to contain provisions on several human rights, on acceptable limitations of these rights, and on a mechanism for an effective implementation. The CRIS also pointed out 4 pillars of communication. Communicating in the public sphere, relating to how ICTs enable citizens to participate in a democratic society. Communication knowledge, which includes, among several concepts, affordable universal access to conventional and ICT-based networks. These two are most similar to the current debate about internet as a human right. There are other aspects of this as well, though. Civil rights in communication, including legal equality and protection against defamation, including issues of privacy and surveillance, and also cultural rights in communication, which really harks back to the earlier RTC debates relating to diversity of culture, cultural identity, and respecting these. So despite extensive preparation to support a constructive multi-stakeholder discussion at the WSIS, Hamlick and Hoffman describe essentially a resurgence of this ongoing acrimonious and unproductive debate. And ultimately, the RTC was not included in the resulting declaration. Also, the language and tone of the documentation appears to equate the RTC with physical access to ICTs. And again, that's something that's very important. That's a component of the RTC, but certainly not its entirety. I'd also like to briefly touch on the universal service principle as it relates to these concepts. Universal service is a foundation of information policy for most of the 20th century, and the idea that all members of society should have access to basic services on a public network. It's not synonymous with RTC, although it is related, as it limits focus to provision of the telecom services or the network. It's best understood as an evolving concept, not as a single policy or linked to a single technology. So, for example, while it has become in some ways synonymous with basic telephone service, plain old telephone service, it certainly was not meant to be linked to that one technology. And a variety of nations have really addressed the internet in the context of universal service. So, for example, Estonia in 2000 passed legislation to make internet provision part of their universal service. Many other nations, including Finland, France, and so forth, and the European Union itself has also discussed including internet provision or created some types of legislation that attempt to make this a reality. So this leads us to the United Nations Declaration of 2011. It's important to note that this was not any type of formal agreement or law, but rather the Special Rapporteur on the Promotion and Protection of the Right to Freedom of Opinion and Expression, Frank LaRue, created this document, and it will be reassessed and part of an ongoing process. In it, LaRue highlights the substantial and transformative potential of the internet, which is seen as an enabler of individuals to exercise their right to freedom of opinion and expression, but also, very importantly, it's also seen as a foundation for an array of other human rights. And he outlines two key dimensions. First, the availability of infrastructure, and also content access without restriction, with the exception of cases where this access violates international human rights law. Availability of infrastructure deals with the provision of telecommunications as well as access to necessary ICTs and software. And of course, it's in line with what I mentioned earlier about the CRS campaign's first and second pillars to some degree, and it's also in alignment with our ideas about initiatives focusing on universal service. However, the claim that internet access should be available to all has already been contested. So, for example, Vinton Cerf, who is known as one of the, end quote, fathers of the internet due to his early work on protocol design, has issued a rebuttal claiming that internet access is not a human right. Rather, he says, technology is an enabler of rights, not a right itself. His concern is that there's too much focus on a single technology, the internet, and that of course that's going to evolve. And I'll argue that while Cerf is correct, that technology is an enabler of rights and should not be the sole focus, the internet itself is not a single technology. It has constantly evolved. It's not a single thing. Rather, it's a socio-technical network employing a wide variety of technical tools, customs, and organizations. He also notes, however, that whatever the technology is at hand, whether it's the internet or some evolution in the future, access itself is not a right. He also says it shouldn't be denied to those who can get it. So here there's a major disagreement between the United Nations Declaration and as well as my own opinion about whether or not we should consider basic internet access something that is available to all people, or that we should create policies that seek to make this so. The second dimension addressed by LaRue is content access, examining how states can restrict, control, or otherwise censor internet content. And while we might think of a number of countries that have been sort of reviled as being censors, for example, China, Burma, Myanmar, and so forth, this is clearly happening around the world, even in countries that consider themselves to be progressive democracies. So some examples that he gives, actually in 6 categories, are the arbitrary blocking or filtering. So for example, what happened with the Arab Spring, there were many instances, for example, Egypt's complete shutdown or attempt to completely shut down the internet for several days, the criminalization of legitimate expression, Chinese or Vietnamese bloggers that are being harassed or shut down, the imposition of intermediary liability, and that's when ISPs or internet service providers are held accountable for any content that are placed on their servers or things that they're connecting to. And this is happening in the US and other countries. Disconnecting users from internet access. A key example of this is France, who appeared to pass a very forward-thinking universal service law, but at the same time, part of this was a 3 strikes law that allowed people to be disconnected from the internet if they were perceived to violate intellectual property laws. He also includes cyber attacks, and this is very interesting because clearly denial of service attacks can restrict people's access. A key example here is Stuxnet, which is now believed, although we don't know for sure, to be an attack designed to destroy facilities in Iran. And it's been concluded by security experts that this was likely a military superpower who created this, and the United States is a key suspect here. And then finally, the inadequate privacy or data protection. This is a very interesting one, and I wish I had a lot more time to talk about it. But for example, with big data and data mining, the Target Corporation is now able to identify pregnant women merely by looking at innocuous seeming things like unscented hand lotion that they purchase, and to identify this before they've made their pregnancies public. So there's clearly a lot of issues at stake here. Essentially, LaRue argues that the freedom of expression and opinion is seen as a fundamental right in its own sense, as well as an enabler of other rights. Again, this sounds very much like the right to communicate. So for example, the right to education, civil and political rights, freedom of association and assembly are all supported by internet access. And so the internet is seen as a catalyst for individuals to exercise these rights. And in doing so, it facilitates the realization of a range of other human rights. So in conclusion, the 2011 UN Declaration has rekindled discussion about human rights in the context of ICTs. However, we really need to distinguish between approaches to communication rights, focusing solely on the provision of access to ICT and skills, the sort of universal service debates. Universal service and access to ICT is certainly an essential component of the RTC, but it's only part of it. Furthermore, the internet can be employed to create public spaces for discourse and a reinvigoration of democratic processes, but this is not guaranteed. The opposite can happen. It can only occur within the larger effort of linking ICT development with human rights efforts worldwide. So we should not separate these two. Finally, the RTC is about human-centered processes of communication and respect for diversity, and this is something that needs to continue to come to the fore. So as far as moving forward, a formal declaration by the international community, as many others have called for, will certainly help to clarify the RTC and help to support other related communication rights. And while the United Nations Declaration falls short of this, it's a good place to start, certainly for focusing our discussion at least. Previous efforts have failed in part because the policy process was carried out in a narrow world of academic and policy experts. This was concluded by Birdsall, McIver, and Rasmussen. And so really, I think another thing that's very essential is including more citizens in public discourse and decision-making about the RTC and what it means in various social cultural contexts. So I thank you very much for your time and attention, and I certainly welcome any questions or comments that you may have. I think this is a very interesting topic, and it touches on so many things that are very important to all of us. Aloha, Jennifer.